But listen, turn with me to the book of Mark. Everybody there? Everybody have a Bible? Perfect. Good. It's been a while. We had Easter last week, of course, and we had Palm Sunday the week before. Thank you, Anthony. And so it's been a couple weeks since we've been in Mark, and I'm excited to be back there. I don't know if you guys can tell or not, but Mark is one of my favorite books. My favorite is John, actually, but Mark is probably, maybe number 3. And here in chapter 6, is one of my favorite chapters in the book of Mark. Now, there are things that are discussed here that are extremely valuable in my opinion. And again, it's been a few weeks since we've been in Mark, and I've been excited, just waiting to get to this chapter. Now, also, I was thinking, it's been a while since we've actually reviewed the purpose of the book. And so I want to quickly just kind of go back over some of those things. And we hit this when we first started in chapter 1 of the book. But, a couple little things to know. John Mark was the author's full name. And he was no stranger to ministry. In Acts chapter 12, his mother, Mary, actually, she's the subject of that text. But the scenario is that Peter is in prison, and they were all gathered at John Mark's house. And it's a good assumption that he was just a kid at the time. And evidently his mother, probably his whole family actually, were involved in ministry, involved in the things of God. So Peter's in prison. In that chapter, we see a prayer meeting going on at his house. But as we think about this and some other things I'm going to share in just a minute, no doubt he was exposed to the things of God pretty much all his life. He got to know the apostles and the other church leaders through the church activities that went on at their home. Years later, Peter refers to him as a son. This is in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. There's a guy named Papias. He was a pupil of John, the Apostle John, and he wrote a work called Explanation of the Lord's Discourses. And in this work that he wrote, he strongly associates John Mark, the author of this book, with Peter. And there are other church leaders, if you read things like Tertullian, Justin Martyr, Origen, some of their works, they also will mention Peter and John Mark as being associated. Now, Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, it tells us that John Mark is actually Barnabas's cousin. And you remember Barnabas from the book of Acts. He was a partner with Paul in ministry. They went on a missionary journey together. This is in Acts chapter 12. So he appears as part of this missionary team. And in chapter 13 of the book of Acts, it tells us that John Mark just bails out for some unknown reason. The missionary journey had not come to its end, but yet this guy takes off. Now, 6 years later, Paul is he's getting ready to go out on a second missionary journey, and he refuses to let John Mark join them. Now, he was Barnabas' cousin, so again, Barnabas was pulling for him to be a part of this journey. No doubt he's saying to Paul, hey, things have changed with this kid. It's not like it used to be, But Paul wasn't going to have it. And it caused a rift between Barnabas and Paul, and it was so much of a rift, so hot of an issue that they actually split up. Now, it's kind of interesting that, they both went separate ways. Of course, from then on, the book of Acts, follows the journeys of Paul. But we know Barnabas, God no doubt was using him elsewhere in the world. But the cool thing is that the story doesn't end there. In AD 62, this is about 12 years later, Paul says this about John Mark. This is Colossians chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. He says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instruction. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus, these are my only fellow workers for the kingdom of God who are of the circumcision. They have proved to be a comfort to me. So things happened during that time period where John Mark obviously grew up a little bit, got a little bit more committed concerning the things of God, and now Paul was saying that he's a fellow worker, and he's proven to be a comfort, and he's sending him out to a church and giving instruction for the church to welcome him. All of a sudden, he's being praised by Paul. In Philemon, Mark is listed by Paul there as one of his fellow laborers. He says, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, greets you, as do Mark, and Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, and my fellow laborers. So he's listed among these men in that book as well. 4 or 5 years after that, Paul writes this to Timothy. He says, get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me in ministry. So we see this about Mark, and not only is it cool that he wrote this gospel, but I love his life story. Just a little bit of information that we get about him. We see that he was a kid who grew up in the things of God. I think about my kids. They've been in church when they were in the womb. They were in church. And they've always been in church, always been around the things of God. But my prayer for my kids is that they wouldn't feel like, okay, well, this is just what we do. It's just a part of our family or whatever. But I pray that they would really get a connection with God, that they would really grow as John Mark grew. Going from that person who has been around these things and probably takes them for granted and probably wasn't very interested at the time, to becoming someone who is profitable to the Lord, profitable for the kingdom. And I'm glad my boys are here even to hear that. Just yet another reminder. They think that maybe, hey, they're just going to be able to do their own thing as they get older, but I'm telling each one of you that God will use you. Mark my words. I pray I live long enough to see it, but I know it's going to happen. It's going to happen. It's also great when we look at John Mark because we see that he wasn't perfect. He made mistakes early on. But that didn't stop him from going on and becoming greatly used of God. And that should be encouragement for all of us. Because who hasn't made mistakes? Who hasn't made bad decisions? Who hasn't rejected the call of God? We're all guilty of those things. But it's kind of nice to see that God doesn't just quit working on us when we make mistakes. God doesn't abandon us. And all the failures that we've had in the past, all the failures even that we're experiencing now in life, are one day going to be part of our testimony, part of our story of how God got a hold of us. Really cool. But concerning the gospel that he wrote, the Gospel of Mark, Peter was a major influence on John Mark. Peter is credited by many scholars as being the primary source of this gospel, not just because of the background information that I presented to you, but also there are certain things that we read here that only Peter would know. John Mark may not have known these things or may not have been present throughout all of these events, but Peter would have known these things. So it's very likely, very plausible that a lot of this information came from his conversations with Peter over the years. But John Mark is writing to Christian Gentiles. He wrote the Gospel of Mark to the believers in Rome, or to the Gentiles in Rome, rather. It's where the book was first published. And his audience is not people who are familiar with the Jewish faith. He doesn't take a whole lot of time talking about Jewish things In fact, when he does talk about Jewish things in certain spots, he goes into detail. He explains the details about it as though he's talking to people that aren't familiar with these things. He doesn't quote a whole lot from the Old Testament. It's also interesting that there are some things that are in the book of Mark that are actually in Aramaic. There are Aramaic terms and Aramaic phrases, and he translates them into Roman terms. I mean, one example off the top of my head is when he encountered the guy who was demon possessed, and he translates. He uses the word legion. You know, when the demon explains who he is, you know, the demon says, "I'm legion." You know, in other words, I have many demons in me. But the word legion is not something that comes from Jewish culture. It's a Roman word. So he uses that word specifically because that's something that his audience would have understood. And so there are a lot of little details like that in the book of Mark. But his objective was not to speak to the people who already had a relationship with God, but his objective was evangelical. He wanted to share the gospel with people that hadn't heard it before. He wanted to share the good news of Jesus Christ. And I love how he does it, because he does it in a way that, I think it kind of appeals to people with OCD. You know, he has this rapid fire way of sharing the things that he shares in his gospel. You know, it's just exciting. He just goes from one story to the next. So I wanted to just kind of refresh us on that. But listen, we last left off with Jesus in Capernaum. He was back in town after healing this demon-possessed man that we were just talking about. But chapter 5, he heals a prominent synagogue leader's little daughter. And he heals a woman who was afflicted for 12 years, with a flow of blood. And now here in chapter 6, where we're going to pick up, we read this. We're told, then he went out from there and came to his own country. And his own country would be about 20 miles southwest, the city of Nazareth. And his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? And what wisdom is this which was given to him, that such mighty works are performed by his hands? Is this not a carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? Now, honestly, don't you expect the people of Nazareth, the people of that region, to be proud of their hometown hero? I mean, shouldn't they be excited to have him back home speaking in their synagogue? You would think that would be the case. We so want that to be the case. If it were us, we would want people to receive us and, oh man, it's great, one of our own made it out, man, that's really cool, and now you've came back to give back to the community. We'd all be excited about that. We would love for that to be the scenario. But the text here says, so they were offended at him. You know, without that line, you would even get the impression that they are proud of him, that they are happy to see him there. But they're saying these things with scorn. They're offended. I mean, look at the questions that they're asking him. And sometimes we get the same questions. And here's what they're basically saying. They're saying, where did he get this stuff? You know, people often question where you get knowledge and wisdom. And people can't accept that maybe you're smart or you're gifted. I mean, do you find that? You know, I mean, a lot of us are on Facebook, right? We see people that we haven't seen, since, middle school. And these people are just so amazed that, like, you even made it. I mean, I get that all the time. I don't know, maybe I was worse than you guys or something, but, people are just like, you're a pastor? They just can't believe it. People can't accept that. They're asking, what makes him so special? And again, not saying this kind of thing in adoration, admiration of him, but It's more like, who died and made you boss? People hate when one of their own rises up through the ranks. I remember years ago working at this warehouse out in Wayne. And I actually wasn't hired as one of the warehouse guys. We were what they called order pickers. So all the cool guys, they would drive the forklifts up and drop the pallets of stuff, and then we would have to take the stuff off the pallet and run it out to the sales floor. So we weren't regarded, we weren't looked upon as the employees on the sales floor, where you have a respectable job. But yet we weren't cool like the other warehouse guys, so we were just kind of like stuck in between. And I remember, how we used to sit around and, talk about those guys. Oh, they think they're so hot, man, driving their forklifts and all of that, But then some months later, I found out there was a job opening. Needless to say, I fell out of favor with all the people that I knew. People just hate to see somebody rise up through the ranks. And some of you have experienced that. I'm sure you've got stories like that, right? People hate to see you get promoted. They're saying to Jesus, you expect us to believe that you're the Son of God? Familiarity breeds contempt, it's a popular expression. I'm sure you've heard it, but this is the case here. These people are stuck on, hey, we used to go to school with you. We lived next door to you. We knew your family. We knew all the dirt that was going on. We knew everything. And now here you are talking about being the Son of God and all this stuff. In Jesus' case, it's really remarkable because when he was born, everybody recognized who he was. But as the years went on, and I'm sure, I wish we had some documentation about those years because, we have nothing. But what must it have been like for Jesus, knowing that he has such a call on his life, and all of his family members and his neighbors and all of the townspeople, they all knew who he was. They all knew the circumstances around his birth. But yet he seemingly had a very uneventful 30 years. I always laugh. I have this cartoon of Mary trying to give Jesus a bath. And she's trying to put him in the tub, and he's standing on top of the water, I always thought that was funny, because... Did Jesus do things like that when he was a kid? We don't know. No documentation about it. No insight into what that was like. However, even looking at the people's attitudes here, it's like evidently they kind of just accepted him as normal. They kind of said, oh yeah, there was all of that fanfare, but here he just seems to be one of us. And so when he steps into his calling, people have a problem with it. They're all refusing to accept. Well, I'll say this for us. I don't know that Jesus changed so much, but I know for us we've changed. I hope we've changed. Since we were in high school or since we were kids. And people tend to not recognize that people change. People get stuck on the way that you were. And that actually is the part of social media that I don't like, because I have people there that, hey, you remember when we did this? I'm like, oh God, no. I don't want to be reminded of that. But I've changed. It's not something that I glory in anymore. It doesn't represent who I am or my objectives or my ideals in life. But yet there are a lot of people that I know that seem to be stuck in the same old rut. They're still living back 25, 30 years ago. And for the most part, some of them are still trapped in the same behavior, doing the same things, getting the same results. They haven't changed. And for a person like that, it's even harder to look at someone else that was right where you were and now see that they've changed. People just tend to not see you as you really are. And, sometimes this works to your advantage because then nobody knows how messed up you really are. But people don't see the gifts. They don't see the callings. They don't see the labor that you've put in over the years to better yourself, to move on from where you were. And of course, all this is in the context of our relationship with God. They don't see how now we are living for something completely different. And how God has validated us and how God uses us. People don't recognize that. They don't see that. And they don't see it mainly because they don't care. Because people only pay attention to the things that are useful to them. You know, the Easter message last week was all about the disconnect between what God is doing and what people are desiring. And that's the case here. They want you to be the same. They want you to be into the same thing, so it helps to validate them. But when they see that you've broken out of the box, it can be a problem. Even back in chapter 3, at the end of chapter 3, Jesus' own family was concerned for him. They were thinking that he was crazy for teaching the things that he was teaching. Even they were offended. They had feelings of contempt. Jesus didn't line up with their opinion of who he should be, or they were stuck on who he was. But looking back at our text here, verse 4, Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house." And that's an amazing thing, how you can go out to your job and you could be a rock star at your job. You know what I mean? You're bettering the company. You're a great employee. Some of you may even be managers, and the way that you manage your department is perfect. Everything is just running smoothly. But then you go home. None of that's recognized. A prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house. Now, I don't know, isn't that kind of sad that Jesus is saying this? Maybe it's sad when we say it, but this is Jesus lamenting over the fact that he has no honor among his own people. And verse 5 is even sadder. It says, "Now he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hand on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And then he went about the villages in a circuit teaching." Now, every time I read this, every time I think about this, it just blows me away. Jesus is the creator of the universe. He's God with us. God in the flesh, with them. He has the name above all names. He has authority. He has power to heal. He is the source of wisdom. He is the source of our salvation. But yet, he could do nothing among these people. We typically think in terms of God being able to do anything. And that's not incorrect. He can do anything. But among people who don't believe, he could do nothing. And it's really not a statement, saying that there's a shortcoming on God's part. But what it is that God has done what God does. But if you don't receive it, it's of no use. There is no benefit. He came to heal. He came to deliver. He came to save. But if you don't believe it, when we see the people of this world that have rejected the things of God, it has nothing to do with God's ability. It has nothing to do with God's awesomeness. It has nothing to do with God's love. But it has all to do with unbelief. It's interesting that unbelief can actually put a stop to God's plan. I'll even hit a nerve this morning and just throw out this question. Why isn't God's plan always realized in your life? I don't know, some people, they say crazy things like, well, I guess God just doesn't want to use me. I guess I really don't have a gift or a call, or maybe I'm just called to be an average Christian. I don't believe that one bit. I don't believe it because it's not supported in the scriptures. We're all in the ministry. We're all ambassadors. We all have been given the Great Commission to go out, preach the gospel. It's been entrusted to us. Not just us up here in pulpits, but us collectively as the body of Christ. So you can't sit and say, well, maybe God's not going to use me. I'm asking you to consider that maybe you're not being used of God because you have unbelief. Now, maybe you believed enough to, say the prayer, accept Him into your life, become a Christian. But do you believe Him when He says that He wants to use you? Do you believe that people will get saved by your hand? Do you believe that when you're among a group of people that you are the Jesus representative to those people? Do you believe that? Do you believe when we pray for people that they're really going to get healed? Do you believe that God can provide? We can run right down the list of things that the Bible talks about, that God does. And when you think about your life, if these things aren't happening in your life, why? Is it a shortcoming on God's part? Or can you be honest and say, well, maybe I just don't believe? Now, before you dismiss all that I just said, saying, oh, not me, Pastor George can't be talking about me. Before you go there, let me point this out. Unbelief can be expressed two ways. First of all, by refusing to accept the truth of God, meaning you disagree and you take a stand against the things of God. But also, unbelief can be expressed by not acting on the truth of God. Maybe you do believe in the sense of agreeing with it. Maybe you do believe in the sense of saying, okay, well, that's possible. I believe it because it happened to so-and-so. Maybe you even believe it as far as having a desire for it. But nothing speaks belief like action. Action. When you really believe something, we know that you believe because we see you doing something. When you believe, you know that you really believe something because you find that you are rolling up your sleeves and you are pursuing something, or you are actively doing something. You are moving towards that thing that you believe. If you receive a phone call and someone on the phone says, hey, you've won $1 million. Just come on down to collect. You'd go, if you believed. If you didn't believe, you'd hang up the phone and be like, yeah, right. That's the simplest way I know how to put it. When you read the Bible, do you believe? Do you believe enough to say, hey, I want to do these same things. I want to put these same things into motion in my life, and I'm going to do it. God says I'm saved, so I'm going to act like a saved person. God says that He's going to use me in ministry, so I'm going to share Jesus. God says He's going to give me wisdom, so I'm going to ask. He's going to provide, so I'm not going to worry. It's the action that says that you believe, not just the statement that you believe. It takes belief to do magnificent things. And adversely, it takes unbelief to miss the magnificent things that God is doing. You could be so faithless that you miss everything that God is doing. Now, in the New Testament, we see often the word faith and often the word belief. And typically they're translated from the same word, same Greek word, pistis, which kind of means like I don't know, off the top of my head, kind of like an exuberant kind of a belief, kind of a qualified belief. Again, the thing that we're talking about here, the kind of belief that causes you to actually do something. We also see, we kind of, see from the context that faith and belief are not really administered in degrees. They are like light switches. In other words, it's either on or it's off. You either believe or you don't believe. Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 17, verse 20. He says, "Assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. And nothing will be impossible for you." He says this in response to, telling the disciples that the reason why they couldn't cast out this demon was because of their unbelief. Jesus then makes the statement after that, He's not speaking literally here. If he were speaking literally, then the folks in Tulsa, Oklahoma would have destroyed every mountain range in the world by now. He's not saying to have faith in faith, because that's what's taught a lot of times. You believe in faith. The faith is not to be in faith, and it's not for the purpose of exercising your will and imposing your power whenever you want to. He's not saying that what we need to have is this big over-the-top, that step aside because I got this kind of faith. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's referring to something humble. He's referring to submission. In that text, he refers to a mustard seed. Now, mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. And in Matthew chapter 13, he's telling a parable about sowing seeds, and he explains a little bit about the mustard seed. But here's the deal. First of all, what is mustard? Mustard is a condiment, isn't it? Have you ever seen a mustard tree? No, because there's no such thing. Mustard is an herb. Herbs at best will grow 3 or 4 feet tall. Little thin plants. It's an herb. It's not something that, is big and boisterous. When we think about an acorn, an acorn is a seed for a mighty oak tree. And Jesus, if he wanted to, could have used that as the analogy, right? If you had faith like an acorn, where it's a little thing, but it's going to grow into this mighty, stable tree. Yeah, but that's not what he said. Faith is like a mustard seed, which grows into a little wiry herb plant. It's small. It's humble. It is what it is. And it relies on God to be what it is. Just as much as the things that are mighty on earth, but this is not a mighty thing. In Luke chapter 17, verse 6, Jesus says, "If you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'Be pulled up by the roots and be planted in the sea,' and it would obey you." And again, it's not meant literally. If it were literal, there would probably be no landscaping anywhere on earth, because all the Christians would be plucking up the bushes and having them cast into the sea. Not meant to be taken literally, but he's the same thing he's saying here. It's not about having an all-powerful, huge, over-the-top, loud kind of faith. But he's saying a faith that's made up of humility and submission. A faith that is real And it's just going to be whatever it is, because it's obeying and just following God's plan. And all seeds are remarkable in that they simply do what they were created to do. I don't know if you've ever studied it or saw a documentary on seeds, but here's something that appears to be dead, right? You put it in the ground, and it still appears to be dead. But then at some point, this seemingly dead thing is calculating the temperature. It's calculating where it is on the earth. It's calculating the amount of moisture. And when all of the conditions line up, this seemingly dead thing comes to life. It produces life. So it's waiting for God's instructions. It's waiting for things to line up with God's parameters. And then it does what God created it to do. A seed is just being obedient, doing what it's created to do. Likewise, our faith should be leading us to simply do what we are created to do. And to simply, be obedient. And again, I'll say there are no degrees of faith. You either have it or you don't. There are no degrees of belief. Sort of believing is still short of believing, isn't it? Either you do or you don't. But know this, we're told in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, that without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Matthew chapter 27, verse 42, here's Jesus hanging on the cross, and one of the religious leaders says, if he is the king of Israel, let him come down from the cross, and then we'll believe in him. We'll believe him if he comes down off of that cross. But think about that. Why didn't Jesus come down off of the cross? Was it because he couldn't? No, it was because he wouldn't. People just don't understand that was God's will. That was God's plan to be on that cross. To God, it was a success. To people who were only thinking about earthly things, carnal things, and selfish things, it was a failure. To see him up on that cross, he had a great run. Man, the movement was really growing. Things were starting to gel, He processed into town. And people were all excited, like this is the week it's going to happen. And it ends with him being crucified. The people that were concerned about their own desires and their own agendas, it was a complete failure. To the earthly minded, they can only believe in one who fulfills their own requirements. But our salvation, even our peace, our well-being, all of that is based on God's requirements. Here's another thing. In Matthew chapter 8, a leper said to Jesus, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. In the same chapter, there was a centurion who came to Jesus asking for his servant to be healed. He said to Jesus, only speak a word and my servant will be healed. And then Jesus said to the centurion, go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that same hour. Now these are two examples of people who had faith. Not faith in faith, but faith in Jesus. They believed. They approached Jesus believing that he could do what they needed him to do. And you contrast that with the folks in Jesus' hometown. They were offended and they had feelings of contempt towards him. Therefore, Jesus, God with us, creator of everything, even the creator of them, could do no works among them. Because they did not believe. Because of unbelief. But it's fortunate, I think, that the Lord works with some of us who are on the fence with belief. And again, looking around the room here, I know all of you to be saved. I know all of you to be people who have confessed Jesus as their Lord and their Savior. You have belief for that. But there are other things where maybe you don't believe God. There are other things where there's lack in your life. And if you really think about it, as I suggested earlier, that it may very well be because you are not trusting God. You are not believing God. Because belief is evidenced by activity, by action. But thank God that he works with some of us that are like that. When we're on the fence about things, when we cross our arms and we declare that, we'll believe it when we see it. God still loves us and he still works with us. You remember Thomas? Thomas is known for saying a few things which earned him the nickname Doubting Thomas. That's how he was always referred to in Sunday school class for me. And I was surprised to find out when I actually read the Bible that wasn't his name. But here's the deal. John chapter 11, Jesus announces that he's heading to Bethany, a town that's on the Mount of Olives, a couple of miles outside of Jerusalem. But there were some Jews at the time in Judea, in Jerusalem and all of Judea, who had attempted to stone Jesus to death. They were looking to kill him. And so when he expressed that he was going to Bethany, because of Lazarus, actually, who had died, his disciples then expressed their apprehension to going. And it was Thomas who spoke up and said, "Let us also go that we may die with him." And I'm sure everybody at that point kind of looked at Thomas and they're like, "Really? Like, Thomas, nobody's trying to die here. Like, what are you talking about, First of all, none of them were moving in faith. None were resting in belief. But Thomas, above all of them, he was not thinking, spiritually. He was thinking that we'll all go down for the cause here. He's thinking about doing the brave thing, the honorable thing, but not having faith, not knowing that, hey, this is somewhere where Jesus is going. If Jesus is going somewhere, then God's got it under control. But he wasn't thinking along those lines. He was thinking carnally. Belief would have been just to go wherever Jesus is going, because nothing outside of the will of God can happen. Now in John 14, there's another story. Jesus had just explained that he was going to prepare a heavenly home for believers. And then Thomas immediately, probably raises his hand and goes, Lord, you didn't tell us where you're going, so how can we know the way? And I'm sure there were people smacking their foreheads going, oh, Thomas, really? But, here's what he's thinking. He's thinking that it was a heavenly home and not a home in heaven. Jesus is talking about a home in heaven. He's thinking, wow, I guess we're going to have some really cool space that Jesus is going to go and have renovated and outfitted for all of us. And he's basically saying, Lord, you didn't tell us the address. How do we know what neighborhood it's in, Lord? He's obviously not thinking spiritually. There's another one in John chapter 20. Thomas, and this is the most famous story, Thomas was skeptical when he heard that Jesus had risen from the dead. Jesus appeared to him and allowed him to inspect the nail piercings, the scars. And Thomas, he seems like he's just really spiritually dense. He then believes, but Jesus says this to him. He says, "Blessed are those who have not seen, yet believed." In other words, Thomas, have a little faith. Thomas, look at this spiritually. But fortunately, it's not game over for any of us when we struggle with belief. Because, the same things happen to us. God is trying to do something spiritual in your life, and you're trying to evaluate it carnally. You're trying to figure out everything, in relation to your desires and your aspirations on this life. You're assessing your own talents and abilities and saying, okay, well, this is the plan, so God, anytime you want to bless my plan. But God is saying, no, let's look at this spiritually. Let's look at what I have for you. Let's look at my abilities to make things happen. But again, fortunately, it's not game over when we struggle. But nonetheless, blessed are we who have not seen, who have not required that God meet our criteria, who have not required that God meets our demands. Blessed are we when we come to know our God and we trust him no matter what. Blessed are we when we have purposed to live our lives for him. And that's as opposed to people who purpose to live their lives for them, and they have a constant prayer out there for God to come and bless that life. It doesn't really work that way. First of all, what is it that we can do on this earth that God has need of? We make it seem like our lives are all that, and the things that are important to us are so important that God has to get behind it. But that's not the case. It's the things of God that are important. It's the things that he's doing in this earth that really matter and that are really important. And we need to believe. We need to trust. We need to have faith. So I'm just going to throw it out. Who's struggling with belief this morning? Anybody? Maybe you've yet to take that step of asking him into your life. I don't know. Maybe you have, but you're in need of asking him to help you with your unbelief in other areas. But if that's you, here's what I want to do. Why don't we all just bow our heads now and just look to the Lord. And if that's you, I just want you to pray like you mean it. Pray with belief that God is going to answer your prayer and that God is going to do something with your life.